Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show. So, Howard Days are upon us. The 28th and 29th of April are dedicated to the life and works of this man right here, Robert E. Howard, creator of a certain Sumerian barbarian who needs no introduction, as well as a host of other characters. Solomon Kane, Bram McMorn, Sailor Steve Costigan, King Kull, Breckenridge Elkins, not to mention a host of other stories not related to any specific character. Suffice to say, the guy wrote a lot during his short life. And he has very much a well-deserved following, which is one of the reasons why there's so many people gathering in Cross Plains, Texas, as we speak, to discuss and celebrate the man's life and works. Now, not everybody can make it, obviously, to Cross Plains at a moment's notice, myself included, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean we can't have some fun doing our own discussions, which is why some friends and I decided to do our own videos on the subject for the occasion. Now, my particular contribution to this has been to answer a question. What's my favorite Conan story? Simple enough, right? Should be easy. Well, I have been going over my copy here of the Complete Chronicles of Conan. These are the original unexpurgated texts. This is the centenary edition of the book. And I've come across one, after all this reading, that I really just think is my favorite of the bunch. It also happens to be one that noted fantasy author in his own right, Fritz Leiber, rated as one of the 3 worst Conan stories ever written by Robert E. Howard. In the May 1968 issue of Fantastic magazine, he described it as repetitious and childish, a self-vitiating brew of pseudoscience, stage illusions, and the genuine supernatural. I mean, ouch, right? And, other people have described it as derivative or as, a prototype for a later story called Red Nails, which has many similarities. I'm going to go to bat for this one, though, because it really is my favorite. This is The Slithering Shadow. Original title, Xuthal of the Dusk, which I do prefer, frankly. This one was originally published in 1933, the September edition of Weird Tales magazine, the cover story of that particular edition, no less. At that point, Howard was pretty good at, knowing what his publisher wanted, which is one of the reasons why this story was written. When I say it was my favorite story, I'm obviously not saying it's the best or the most inspired, because obviously this one was written for cash, as you can probably imagine from certain inclusion of certain scenes which got it the cover illustration there. Once you get to know what Margaret Brundridge was into, well, you knew exactly what you needed to put into the story to make her want to do the cover. It takes place. Well, it's published between Black Colossus and Pool of the Black One, but depending on which internal chronology of Conan's tales you go by, some people think it takes place between, an unpublished one called The Snout in the Dark and A Witch Shall Be Born. It depends on who you ask, obviously. The story itself is self-contained, so it's really not that much of an issue. It places Conan, along with his demoiselle of the story, a Brythunian slave girl named Natalia that he rescues from some slavers before the story ever takes place, at the edge of a vast desert, having been part of a large mercenary army that was just been destroyed, and then her being the only known survivors of the whole massacre. They're now trapped in this brutal wasteland, slowly dying of thirst. Conan is now contemplating giving her a quick mercy kill so that she avoids that fate, which is just telling just how bad things have gotten. When they encounter a lost city, or at least a strange city in the midst of the desert, out in the middle of nowhere, no farmlands, nothing. They come to this place, and the place is seemingly abandoned until they find a dead body. A dead body that gets up and starts attacking, which Conan immediately dispatches. And things just get stranger from here. The city itself is not a city. It's one large building encompassing an entire city, what in sci-fi terms would be deemed later on as an arcology, which is to say a self-contained city within a single superstructure, completely self-enclosed and self-sufficient in its own right. From there he encounters other, members of these strange people that live in this place, the city of Xuthal, as he comes to know it, as well as a non-native citizen of the place, a Stygian woman named Thalis, who explains to him some of the background of the place and makes certain advances towards Conan, who is as she describes it, more of a man than any of the men that she has encountered in this place since she first arrived here. Well, naturally, Natalia isn't too happy about that either, and, well, when Conan makes it quite clear that he's not interested in sticking around, well, things go from bad to worse. There's betrayals, there are battles against the inhabitants of the city, and, of course, the eponymous slithering shadow itself, an eldritch demon or god thing or whatever the hell it is that is known as Thog to the inhabitants. A strange Lovecraftian nightmare creature that every now and then wakes up and gobbles up some of the Xuthalians, I guess that's how you call them, the people of Xuthal, and is now setting its sights on Natalia, and Thalos too, and pretty much anyone else it can get its tentacles on. So, this seems probably like a pretty standard, prototypical sword and sorcery tale, and I can understand that, because when you look at all the different, copycats and derivatives of Conan that have come over throughout the years, especially, when Fritz Leiber wrote that in 1968, there was quite a few of them by then. I can understand thinking it's nothing particularly impressive, especially compared to like certain other more, artistic statements type stories, like, Red Nails, for instance, or for instance, like what was it? Beyond the Black River. Completely, spaced on that one. But yeah, obviously something like Beyond the Black River, which is far more personal to Howard. Or as one can easily see the similarities between this and later Red Nails, which is far more of a grander story in many ways. This one is very much a bottle story. It's very enclosed on itself in that regard. But I think it comes down to the fact that this one was the first. You often see this in cases of older stories that have been copied and recopied over and over again, and throughout the years, where we come back to them and they don't feel as special until you remind yourself that this is where it all started. This is probably the prototypical sword and sorcery tale, and is very much the most Conan story. It's had all the elements. It's got the barbarian hero right there in the center of it all. You have both the damsel in distress, but also the femme fatale, and you have the vast hordes of enemies that coming at our hero who has to fight it out against them. You have the Lovecraftian terror that plagues this place. You have the sense of oddness and wonder of this strange location that's almost out of place and out of time compared to the rest of the world. And you have that same kind of exploration of those common themes that Howard had in Howardian sword and sorcery of civilization versus savagery versus and those kinds of things. Here it's very much not so much civilization versus savagery, but civilization when it goes wrong. We'll see this again in other stories, such as, for instance, the aforementioned Red Nails, which very much took many of the elements of this and went off in a different direction with that. But here you see a civilization that reached heights that have not been hit anywhere else for relatively in the Hyborian Age, but has reached those points and is now degrading and degenerating because of them. These are people who it's theorized by certain Howard scholars that they're probably Lemurian descendants who came from the east after great cataclysms and rebuilt their cities here at the edge of Stygia and such, and had technology and certain sciences that allowed them to create these vast arcologies. They have radium gems that serve as light sources. They can generate food and water as if from the air itself. So they were very much completely self-sufficient and have no longer any need for toil or hard work in order to sustain themselves. They use the drugs derived from the Black Lotus to expand their consciousness in their sleep, to explore various dream worlds and experience other realities and other states of consciousness, to the point that when they do wake up, they encounter Conan and Nutella, they have a hard time determining whether or not they're actually real or just another figment of their imagination, and they can just dismiss with a wave of the hand and get kind of freaked out when they realize, oh crap, these guys are real, what the hell? And even more freaked out when they realize that their god/tormentor Thog is currently on the loose, when Conan describes how a strange shadow appeared and made one of the inhabitants of Xuthal was just sprawl unconscious on a bed, disappear with only like a single drop of blood left in his wake. So there is that creeping menace that is always building throughout as soon as they get to the city, and that is very much like something I like about this story. And this one has, and not Red Nails, the feeling of oppressive doom. This is like a doom metal album. If we're going from the metal comparisons, if Red Nails is pretty much power metal, this one is doom metal. It's got that feel to it. It's grim without being grim dark. It's grim and dark without being grim dark, if that makes any sense. It's still very much in that more sword and sorcery feel to it without being too gritty to it. But it does have that sense of oppressive darkness to it. The whole city has this. And as they explore this place and find whole tables covered in victuals and meals and food completely abandoned and just left there, and you get this feeling of this place that is like frozen in time, but still slowly degrading. As Thalos explains to it, the people of Xuthal have pretty much given up on everything other than their own sensual pleasures, as she describes it. The way they just, lay back, shoot themselves up when you're smoking or whatever the way they take in their particular Black Lotus drugs in order to experience other places other than where they are, and are constantly on the lookout for the next experience. But in the process, they're not really taking care of themselves anymore. They basically just wake up to eat and, get laid every now and then, especially with Thalos, who, as she describes, is the only thing that the men of Xuthal are willing to forego their sleep for. Yeah, she's basically the town bicycle, which she has come to terms with. She was raised in the temples of Derketo as a noblewoman, Stygia. So, yeah, even then, she describes the people of Xuthal as putting her through her paces. In fact, she says to Conan that it would be probably more merciful to slit Natalia's throat than to let the people of Xuthal get their hands on her. That's the kind of level of moral degradation, shall we say, that the people here have had. And I suppose that stems to a reason, because if you live in lucid dreams your entire life, where you have complete control over that, well, you can imagine a certain sense of arrogance and megalomania that's going to come to that when you feel like you have complete control over reality and it can't say no to you anymore. You kind of get used to that, I imagine. In any case, things go completely berserk after a while when the people of Xuthal realize that Conan and Natalia are actually there. And things go bad to worse because Thalos also has her eyes on Conan, who she sees as far more of a real man than any of the people of Xuthal are anymore, and wants to have him to herself so that she can use him to rule over this city for as long as it lasts, because of course with Thog on the loose every now and then, the population is gradually going towards extinction. This whole civilization is on the verge of complete collapse, and in fact is hardly a civilization anymore, in the fact that the people of it are completely detached from their own existences. I mean, I don't want to say that this story has relevance to today, but I think a lot of people could probably say this story has some relevance to today. How many people live in digital dream worlds of social media and online existences versus, caring more about their day-to-day real lives? You know what I mean? There's very much a certain amount of relevance, I think, to the themes and, to the themes and general feel of this tale that I think still can be used as, more parable, so to speak, or an applicability to the, our current lives. And that is something that, is tantamount for really, really good stories, regardless of who writes them or what genre. And I think also, stemming also to that, doom, that oppressive atmosphere, is the Lovecraftian element to this story. This one is possibly more so than any other Conan tale. This one, Thog is basically a Shoggoth in many ways, or in terms of how it's described, and in terms of how it operates and the way that it reacts to when it's attacked or when it starts doing its thing. It is just this amorphous ever-changing blot of darkness. It seems to absorb the light in the room, except for the eyes. This thing's eyes are always glowing, this unhealthy luminescence. And the way it's described, see, when Natalia first encounters this thing, she strained her eyes into the blackness beyond the rim of the dim light, tense with fear of what she might see. A whimpering gasp escaped her lips. The darkness was taking form. Something huge and bulky grew out of the void. She saw a great misshapen head emerging into the light. At least she took it for a head, though it was not the member of any sane or normal creature. She saw a great toad-like face, the features of which were as dim and unstable as those of a spectre seen in a mirror of nightmare. Great pools of light that might have been eyes blinked at her, and she shook at the cosmic lust reflected there. She could tell nothing about the creature's body. Its outline seemed to waver and alter subtly, even as she looked at it, yet its substance was apparently solid enough. There was nothing misty or ghostly about it. It's described as the way it moves as indescribable. You can't tell how it's moving, whether it's crawling, walking, shifting, wriggling, flying. It's completely beyond her understanding how it moves. It appears to her as towering above her and climbing up at her at the same time. And if the thing has an appearance that is somewhat resembling the Shoggoth from In the Mouth of Madness, in the sense of it's, constantly shifting and changing its appendages and all that stuff, its intentions are far different. That thing just wanted to kill you. This thing, it has other intentions, as it described from that cosmic lust mention. I don't know if any Japanese animation creators ever read this story and got inspired, but I can imagine they would, because goddamn, there is a sense of perverse intelligence to this thing that you don't always get, especially from Lovecraft himself. His stuff was, in spite of certain elements, was rather sexless, frankly. But Howard isn't afraid to go there to imply certain aspects of this stuff. Yeah, and as soon as it's got tentacles, things are gonna get creepy. And that's, of course, when Conan comes into it. And I do like the way this story happens. As soon as they get separated, because Thalos grabs Natalia and pulls her through a secret passage to get her to herself so she can take out her rival, as much as Natalia doesn't really care about what Thalos wants, just wants to get out of this place. You cut between events that are happening to her and events that are happening to Conan as the people of the city are awakening and coming to attack him, and him fighting his way through them, cutting them down one by one, because these people, as I said before, they live in dream worlds. They're not as practiced in combat and, brutal, real world fighting as he is. So while they do manage to injure him quite a bit, they don't manage to kill him, and he manages to put down quite a few of them until he's sent through a trapdoor that does send him pretty much where he needs to be. Which is to say, just as Thog is trying to get its tentacles on Natalia. But that's not before some really creepy, nasty things happen, because it gets its tentacles on Thalos first, who had been torturing her at the time, and pulls her off in the darkness, and we don't see anything that happens. This was written in 1933. They weren't going to do that kind of stuff, go that extreme. But we do hear what Natalia hears. From the black shadows came sounds, incomprehensible and blood-freezing. She heard Thalos' voice pleading frenziedly, but no voice answered. There was no sound except the Stygian's panting voice, which suddenly rose to screams of agony and then broke in hysterical laughter mingled with sobs. This dwindled to a convulsive panting. Presently this too ceased, and a silence more terrible hovered over the secret corridor. We don't know exactly what happens, but the implication, especially to my mind, is that Thog isn't just eating her. Take from that what you will. This story gets pretty dark without actually going over the line into, full-on, grimdark there. But still, that was pushing it for 1933. Let's face facts. And then, of course, Conan finally, fights his way through the people of Xuthal, ends up in the same chamber, and immediately just sees what's going on and attacks. And it is a brutal fight against an enemy that Conan cannot really kill. This thing is not vulnerable to mortal weapons virtually at all. It describes here the fight here. He could not tell whether he was slashing off its members or whether he was cleaving its bulk, which knit behind the slicing blade. He was tossed to and fro in the violence of that awful battle, and had a dazed feeling that he was fighting not one but an aggregation of lethal creatures. The thing seemed to be biting, clawing, crushing, and clubbing him all at the same time. He felt fangs and talons rend his flesh, flabby cables that were yet hard as iron encircled his limbs and body, and worst of all, something like a whip of scorpions fell again and again across his shoulders, back, and breast, tearing the skin and filling his veins with a poison that was like liquid fire. At one point, he bites into Thog, and just the bit that stays in his mouth wriggles like a still living thing. It's like, this thing, if you ever wanted to see what it would be like to get into an actual sword fight with a Shoggoth, this is the story for you, frankly. Eventually, he does manage to hit something important in Thog, and you're not sure whether or not he forces it to flee down the well from which it came, or if it just, decides, screw this isn't worth it, and just leaves because he's more used to just, grabbing the people of Xuthal from their beds and while they sleep than, actually fighting someone, and just got, bored maybe of this whole thing, or just decided that this particular morsel was a bit too bitter to swallow. But in the meantime, Conan comes out of this fight on the verge of death. This is the story, other than maybe A Witch Shall Be Born, where he ends up crucified at one point, which we, if you ever watched the 82 Conan the Barbarian movie, you've seen a bit what that was like. But this is the one story where Conan, he's not going to make it. He's on the verge of death here. Part of his scalp has been torn. He's covered in wounds. Not just like those whip of scorpions described. He's got poison and burning through his veins. There's virtually not a piece of him that isn't been bloodied, bruised, or sliced and diced. He's in very, very bad shape. And he owes his survival to a character that has been talked about in almost always negative terms. Natalia, the Brythunian, young blonde Brythunian slave girl that he rescued, who spends the entire story basically going, "Oh, Conan, what shall we do?" Because she's not a fighter. She's not the traditional strong female character, I guess you could say. She is very much a regular young girl who has no real experience or desire to become a great warrior or, a survivor of, dark and dreary times. This is just someone who just wants to live her life and get the hell out of this place before something horrible happens, and is scared out of her mind. In other words, she's the audience. Most of us are not hardened soldiers or, adventurers. Most of us are just regular folk who would be crumbling and, knocking our knees and, peeing our pants at the kinds of situations that are in this story. And throughout it, she does get that character development. Conan himself, you rarely see him get the kind of thing inside stories. You see him develop as you read the entire corpus, as he changes from one story to another, as he, comes into his own throughout his career. Any kind of character development is usually in the form of the other characters that surround him. In her case, she starts out as completely, practically useless, a load. Conan's one, at the start, is about to kill the poor girl to spare her an even worse death. That's, how bad he thinks she's about to get it. Thalas says that when they speak to her that Conan would be better to slit her throat before the men of Xuthal get their hands on her, or they'll put her through the paces that she would not survive. Unlike Thalas, who, is more or less come to terms with her existence. And, that's, it gives an indication of just how bad things are for the female people in the city of Xuthal. It's not exactly the nicest place for people to be. And yet throughout this, she doesn't, run away. She doesn't fully, crack under the pressure. She stays by Conan's side because he is the, closest thing she has to a proper someone who could protect her from all this crap. And when she's forced to be on her own, she does try her hardest to survive on her own. She pulls a knife on Thalos and does manage to injure her, although it doesn't really help too much because Thalos is a complete psycho at this point, who has fallen not so much in love or in lust with Conan, but sees him as a way of gaining control over Xuthal because he is so much more powerful than the average inhabitant of the city. And even then, after all the terrible things that have happened, she's the one who goes off, after bandaging his wounds as best she can, goes off in the sea to try and find some solution, try to find a way out, a way of healing him, and does come across one of the women of Xuthal sleep on her dreaming bed with a goblet of the golden wine that was described earlier in the story, which is basically one of the only indications of like a healing potion in all of Howard's stories. This kind of stuff really doesn't happen very often, as you can imagine. Healing magic isn't exactly known for this kind of Hyborian sword and sorcery. And she comes about things and thinks to herself, she's still got the dagger she took off of Thalos there. And she's about to raise it, kill this woman before she wakes up and can, either attack them or alert others. And then doesn't. She stops herself. She's like, no, I'm not going to do this. Puts the dagger away, takes the wine, the golden wine to Conan and gives it to him so that, which does help and save him. It allows him to recover from his wounds as it, allows to refresh the stamina and the vitality of the people of Xuthal, which is, how they also live so long. She's the moral center of this story. Thalos is a representation of, in many ways, someone who has accepted this status quo and is just as the people of Xuthal are extremely fatalistic and just, are fine with this, just, slowly, dying for lack of reproduction or from Thog just munching on them one by one. And Thalos is someone from the outside who has come to accept this nihilistic, fatalistic kind of point of view. Natalia doesn't. And she doesn't lose herself to the, create madness and the violence and, the general moral malaise of Xuthal. She could have killed this person. It probably would have been practical to do so, even if it wasn't absolutely necessary, just as a precaution, but she doesn't. She still retains that humanity that the people of Xuthal have lost over the generations, over having lost their connection, not just, to reality, but to each other in many ways. Their sense of empathy is completely shot. Thalos is as well. But she retains a bit more of that humanity, although twisted by her, long existence here. Conan is a warrior. He is the practical, he'll kill if he has to. He won't go out of his way to kill you if he doesn't have to, but he will if he thinks that, if it's the right thing to do in this case, and he's got no compunctions about it. Natalia, she's a normal, ordinary person. She has a normal, ordinary person's sense of right and wrong. And this is very much like the moral center of the story. She is that good person. This is what brings this story, I think, away from going full on to the kind of grimdark that would come out later on as a derivation of the sword and sorcery genre. The story still has that sense where good people aren't always punished for being good. You don't get that sense only bastards survive in this world. No. You need to have some strength behind your sword arm in order to survive these kinds of things because, violence is a natural part of the human condition and it does need to be recognized. But that doesn't mean you have to give up all your humanity just to keep yourself going. In fact, because at that point, what would be the point, right? It very much is, I think, that kind of sense that the story does have. How should I put this? It's the themes of this story that I think don't get necessarily as recognized because it falls under that more derivative or prototypical sword and sorcery kind of veneer. But if you dig into these stories, read them a couple of times and really get into it, you really get the sense this is very much that first real exposition you have to that recurring theme that Howard have of barbarism and civilization. And here showing civilization extended so far away from its original barbaric roots, so to speak, that raising up into these, loftier altered states and loftier dreams of, the distant cosmos, that no longer is grounded in the dirt and the muck and the blood and sweat and toil that, the rest of us have to live with. And those kinds of things are very much where sword and sorcery really, really, really derives its thematic weight. It's, it's got the grim and the grind to it, while not reveling in it. And I don't think this story really revels in, the darkness that it contains, but uses it to make a point. And I think that's one of the reasons I like this story so much. And as much as I like Red Nails, and I do like Red Nails quite a bit, it doesn't have that same kind of, dark vibrancy that Xuthal the Dusk has. That story, the inhabitants of Xuthal, the other city, which is, as you can imagine from the name, probably related to this one, have already taken out the dreaming, previous civil owners of the city, the founders of it, and are now just, basically squatting in the place. So while you do have that idea of a civilization gone amok, that, Hatfield McCoy kind of blood feud that's happening in that story, you don't really have that same degradation and despoiling of their own world that the people of Xuthal have, done to themselves. These are people who rose up to such heights that they lost track of what was ultimately really important and are now paying the price for it. They now live completely out of touch with, basic humanity, which, when reintroduced via Conan and Natalia, things go bad for them very, very quickly. Suffice to say that the population of Xuthal has gone down quite a bit after Conan went through it. Yeah. For those of you people who enjoy, big fight scenes, brutal fight, combat and stuff like that, there's plenty of it in here. 3 men confronted him at the foot of the marble steps, and he struck them with a deafening crash of steel. There was a frenzied instant when the blades flamed like summer lightning. Then the ground fell apart, and Conan sprang up the stair. The oncoming horde tripped over 3 writhing forms at his foot. One lay face down in a sickening welter of blood and brains. Another propped himself on his hands, blood spurting blackly from his severed throat veins. The other howled like a dying dog as he clawed at the crimson stump that had been an arm. So yeah, if you enjoy your, fantasy ultra-violence, you're going to get your fair share in this thing. Not to mention Thalos, topless the entire time. So yeah, you're going to get some good times with that too. Overall, I can understand why some people poo-poo or they'll look astride at, Xuthal the Dusk. But for my money, it represents everything I want from sword and sorcery. It's, like I said, the prototypical one from which very much all the others are descended. It's the one that really stands out as the inspiration. It provided all the basic tropes that make up a sword and sorcery story. And if those tropes are just put together as is, you're not going to necessarily get something as good as this. That's not always the case. You need the talent of someone like Robert E. Howard behind those, concepts to really make them sing. And I think the same thing can be done with, other good sword and sorcery authors, just taking the basic ingredients and writing a rip-roaring great tale. It can be done. It has been done. And for my money, this one is my favorite Conan story. Well, that's all I have to say about that. Whether you agree or disagree, that's up to Chrome to decide what to do with you about you. In the meantime, I have been Zero Sum. Have a happy Howard days, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.